Hey everybody, Paul Craig Roberts back again with us today to explain part three of what he calls the Great Dispossession, and also which author David Rogers Webb calls the Great Taking, how all of our financial assets, our savings, our money, our IRAs, everything is going to be used as collateral in the next financial crisis to bail out the big guys. We will own nothing and supposedly be happy. Now, Paul, how and why are you and David Rogers convinced that this is looming, this is about to happen, that will happen before too long? Why are you convinced of that? How and why is the evidence there?
Okay, Larry. The main piece of evidence is that after a decade or longer of the Fed's quantitative easing, it's essentially zero interest rate policy. I mean, there was some very small nominal interest rate, but it was below the rate of inflation. So actually, the real interest rate was negative for a decade or longer. So during that time, uh, financial institutions could only get low yielding assets on their books in the investment portfolios. You've got low yielding assets. Even the stocks, in recent years, we've learned that only 6 or 8 of them actually going up in value, tech stocks. And so if you spend a decade or longer accumulating, say, low interest rate bonds in your investment portfolio, and then the Fed quickly and suddenly alters interest rate policy, and interest rates go from, say, 1% to 5%.
Yeah.
They just wiped out 80% of the value of your portfolio of bonds. The bonds have collapsed. And so the bank's balance sheet is out of whack. There's no value there on the value side to back the liabilities. And when you look at the extraordinary number of derivatives that are out there, there are quadrillions apparently of these derivatives that are many times the value of world gross domestic products. So there's no backing. Even with all of our own, or what we think is our own assets, there's no backing. So the situation is completely ripe for a crisis. A bank that you see, a bank whose balance sheet is so out of whack is bankrupt.
Well, David Rogers Webb points out the velocity of money is the lowest it's ever been. And he says that the velocity of money was low preceding the crash of 29. So history is about to repeat itself. Do you see it that way?
Well, he certainly has a very convincing graph of the behavior of velocity of money. And it certainly is, according to that graph, the fact that declines in velocity seem to be precursors to serious economic difficulties,
Quick
such as the Great
definition.
Depression.
Quick
The reason
definition.
he
Quick
gives the
definition of
reason. Sorry?
quick definition of velocity of money. What is it?
Okay, that's a good idea. The velocity of money is the rate at which money turns over. So if people are on a spending kick and they're rapidly spending their money, the velocity at which that money is turning over, passing from hand to hand through the system, is strong, is high. If, on the other hand, the velocity of money is slow or low, that people are trying to hold on to money. They're not anxious to spend. Then the velocity or the rate of turnover is falling. And Webb makes the point, which I think is correct. It's certainly consistent with the equation monetarists use, that the money supply times the rate at which it turns over equals the gross domestic product. So Webb says if you're expanding the money supply, like the Fed was doing during quantitative easing,
Right.
if velocity is falling, you don't get economic growth, because the decline in which the rate the money is turning over offsets the increase in the supply of money. And so what happens is the prices of financial assets get bid up during this time. And like if you had a 3% bond and the Fed drops interest rates to 1%, you've had a huge capital gain. But from then on, you're accumulating new bonds at 1%.
Yeah.
So you're building a portfolio that's in risk. Well, rates go up.
Yeah, so it
The
creates
same with stocks. It creates bubbles and busts.
yeah.
It's a policy that can do nothing but create a bubble and a bust. It creates the bubble when they are lowering the interest rates by buying everything, and it creates the bust when they raise the interest rates and everybody's assets are devalued. So it's the main function of the Fed. We'll get into this later, perhaps. The only thing the Fed has ever done is cause recession and crises, depressions, and recessions. So Webb says that if the Fed is creating money while velocity is falling, it's pushing on a string in terms of the real economy. It doesn't stimulate the real economy. It drives up the price of financial assets. But that very process builds portfolios that are vulnerable when the policy reverses.
And that's where the Great Reset comes in, where everything that we own, everything that we have of value is converted into collateral to bail out the big guys, right? That's what's at hand.
It's a perfect fit. And, we're all indoctrinated against any divergence from an official narrative on the grounds that it's a conspiracy theory to diverge.
Yeah.
But if you look at this, it really looks like a conspiracy, because the whole time that the World Economic Forum has been pushing its line of the Great Reset, you will own nothing, the Federal Reserve has been creating the real world basis for that. They're creating the basis for this to happen. And it's really quite astonishing. You can say it's a conspiracy theory, but it's a perfect fit.
Well, also something that they set in motion, which few people realize the impact of, was the Dodd-Frank Act, which prioritized derivatives over bank depositors. So in other words, when the crash comes, we're last in line to get any recovery.
That's right.
The derivatives get it and banks get it first. We don't. We're last in line.
We're last in line. That is what we think are owners.
Yeah.
Are last in line because we've been dispossessed in the event of a serious crisis. And as we look at the evidence, we seem to be on the verge of a serious crisis.
Yeah.
It's the same as the previous collapse in 2008. And except much larger because they did nothing about restraining the creation of derivatives. And of course, they're far more now.
And this is setting the stage for the introduction of what until now has been poo-pooed as just a conspiracy theory, the introduction of digital currency. And what that means is total control over how we spend our money and total control of what's approved of and what's disapproved of. So, Paul, why
Yes.
don't you get into that a little bit, how that would work?
Yes, central bank digital currency.
Right.
They don't mean Bitcoin or those are private, and they of course would all be illegal. Well, actually, Webb quotes the general manager of the Bank of International Settlements,
Right.
to the effect that with digital currency, they will know how we use it. And therefore, he quotes this Bank of International Settlements general manager, saying that we can control its use. So what that means is they can disapprove your purchases. They can punish you for purchases that are disapproved. They can withhold your allotment of income if you are dissident. In other words, they get total control, not only of how you live your life, but how well behaved you are and how compliant you are with official narratives. And if you are a questioner of official narratives, you can be punished by withholding your funds because they will come from the central bank.
Similar to social credit scores, which I believe are already in operation in China.
Yeah, that's right. In China, they watch people's behavior, and if it's inappropriate, if they're young, they can't go to the university, or people can't travel, they can't get a passport, they can't get a driver's license. Their allotments of money are curtailed, and so on and so on. So it's a total control mechanism. It's far beyond the kinds of controls that George Orwell imagined in 1984 or Huxley in Brave New World. What the digital revolution does, it creates perfect and total control over individuals.
Yeah, well, Paul, the way David Rogers Webb sees it, analyzes it, is that they create this financial crisis worse than the Great Depression, which is the perfect opportunity when we've lost everything. We have no more assets, nothing. Our houses that are mortgaged, our car payments, all that's gone. We have no money to do anything with. So then they come along as a good deed for the population. They introduce digital currency, and the population is grateful because we're on the verge of financial chaos. So it's a perfect opportunity to make the public accept digital currency as their savior.
Exactly. That's exactly the situation that Webb describes. And it's plausible. I mean, it's completely plausible. What else can they do? We already have gone through, there's no doubt they have changed the regulations so that if there is a serious financial crisis like the one in 2007 or 08, whenever the last one was, or one like the Great Depression, any kind of a crisis of that level, and Webb says it's going to be much larger this time, since they have turned our property into collateral for the people holding the bag, we don't have anything, nothing. You haven't got a dime that you can use on a credit card account or write a check on a bank to pay for anything. You can't buy any groceries, you can't pay any rent, you can't pay any mortgage, you can't pay any utility bill, you can't buy any fuel, you can't do anything. And so it'll be just extraordinary chaos. People, what are they doing? I mean, they're dying, they're starving, they can't. You, they can't live on the streets. They don't even have money for a bottle of water. So along comes the central bank. Oh, we've got to save you. We've created bank accounts for all of you, and we're going to put money in,
Right.
digital money, and you can use this digital money to do everything. And so everybody will be relieved. They'll say, "Oh gosh, thank God for the Fed. They'll never catch on. The Fed engineered the whole thing in order to get control over them. They'll never catch on to that."
And another mechanism of control, which hasn't gotten much publicity, is the food supply.
We'll eat bugs.
Yeah, I mean they're dispossessing farmers already in some of the European countries, even I guess in the U.S. now, and they're talking about eating bugs. So they control the food supply. When people are starving, they'll accept anything.
Right. Yeah, I mean, they like in Holland, in Ireland, they have destroyed, I think, in each country, 200,000 cows. So it's had tremendous impact on butter and cheese, milk. No doubt it's intended to curtail beef. And the argument is that cows pass gas, methane, and thereby create global warming. And so wanting to have milk and butter and cheese and beef, you're destroying the planet. And so they have to destroy the cows. I heard somebody the other day who seemed to be knowledgeable saying this was nonsense, that it's not cows that pass methane because they chew their cud. It's horses. So now they're turning on the horse community, the people who enjoy horses and ride them in shows and compete and Western rodeos. Now they're going to blame all of them for global warming, take their horses away. So yeah, it's they create these narratives that support the agenda.
Yeah, in all the ages of the earth, with all the species of animals, which there are far fewer today, all through those ages, we had no problem with global warming from animal excretions. Now, all of a sudden, they're a threat. I mean, this whole thing is so ridiculous, and
It's ridiculous.
it's being given credence by so-called experts that the people assume are experts.
Yeah, they're just lying through their teeth. I think they're paid. It's the creation of a narrative that supports the global warming thesis. Look, you're right, Larry. I mean, just imagine the United States, the massive herds of buffalo.
Yeah.
They were massive, massive herds. They were intentionally exterminated by the Union Army following the so-called Civil War in order to wipe out the Plains Indians.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, there were massive herds of these. Look at Africa.
Yeah.
Massive herds of animals, almost all of them near extinct, greatly reduced in numbers. There's nothing like the herds of antelope and zebras and giraffes and elephants that there were. And consequently, even lions are becoming rare. But these massive herds of animals, and yet the earth survived. And apparently at one time we had these massive dinosaurs.
Yeah.
And we had the great huge ones with the long necks that didn't do anything but eat vegetation.
Right.
and they didn't destroy the world creating methane gas. So
Yeah, it shows you how any absurdity now they could sell because they've got control of the media. You know, they have the control of all the mechanisms of information and so-called education. You know, Paul, what Webb is saying, and I guess you agree with, is that this is really an effort to reestablish feudalism.
yeah, exactly. There'll be a very, very few people in control, and everyone else is a serf. Actually, be worse than serfs, because serfs had a lot of use rights. They had use rights in the land, use rights in the forest. Um, Today, you won't have any right at all, and in fact, you have to completely toe the line, or they cut you off from the ability to live once this system goes into place. Now, it all sounds so far-fetched, and yet
Right.
we've been listening to Klaus Schwab and Bill Gates and the World Economic Forum for years. And quite clearly, they're serious. And we see the Fed's policy, beginning with quantitative easing, it perfectly sets in motion their agenda. It perfectly supports it.
And what you're
It
saying,
doesn't lead to any other outcome except you will own nothing.
and what you're also saying is, you know, whether it is by design, intentional, or it's just occurred because of the changes in the regulations that keep the big guys safe to bail them out. It doesn't matter whether it was intentional or not. The result is the same. A great
Exactly.
reset where everything changes.
Exactly. That's right. It means a total extinction of freedom of any personal responsibility. You won't have any responsibility of yourself except not to challenge the narratives.
Paul, for our viewers who may not be familiar with your background, to disabuse them of the concept that you're some kind of a nutcase conspiracy theorist, you were the Assistant Treasury Secretary under the Reagan administration. You have a vast knowledge of government operations. You have an incredible education behind you. So you're no nutcase. And you're saying that this really seems like it could be occurring, that it's something to be taken very seriously.
Well, first of all, I'm just reporting on Webb's book. And Webb is a participant in the system, hedge fund manager. He noticed these kinds of regulatory changes, what's going on, and studied them closely. He went through all of the regulatory changes. There's no doubt that these regulatory changes occurred. There's absolutely no doubt they occurred.
And what?
And they have the effect that Webb says. You own nothing if there's a financial crisis. So as for me, yes, let's see. I was professor at distinguished universities, a number of them. I was an editor of the Wall Street Journal. I was in the congressional staff, the House, the Senate, committee staffs, personal staffs. I was chief economist for the Republicans on the House Budget Committee. I was the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. I have the French Legion of Honor for my outstanding contributions to economic science. I have the Treasury's Silver Medal and awards for outstanding contributions to the formulation of United States economic policy. I have Who's Who in America's Lifetime Achievement Award, the French Legion of Honor. I have the Press Club of Mexico's International Journalism Prize. I mean, it's endless.
Yeah.
It's absolutely endless. I was a Business Week columnist, the first outside columnist Business Week ever had. And I was a columnist for a dozen or 15 years. I can't remember. I was Scripps Howard News Service columnist. There's 300 newspapers. I mean, it's not a conspiracy theory. There's no doubt about quantitative easing. There's no doubt about what quantitative easing did. It drove up stock and bond values and created a bubble. And the minute you raise interest rates, all those values fall, that you lose those values. It loaded up financial portfolios with low-paying assets because of the low interest rate policy. You reverse that policy, you destroy balance sheets. It's no doubt. This is just ordinary accounting, ordinary economics. There's not any conspiracy about it. So the question is it just a coincidence? What does it matter? Like you said, it's real, whether intended or just some kind of unfortunate coincidence.
People have asked, so what do we do? Do we take our money? Do we go to cash and hide it under a mattress? But you're saying when this occurs, if it does occur, they're going to ban paper currency. It's and introduce digital, correct? So
Well,
even if we take our money out of the bank, cash, we won't be able to use it.
well, it's just like the early 30s when they said gold's no longer money. You can't use it to make payments. Turn it in or go to prison.
Yeah.
So they'll just say fiat currency is no longer a legitimate means of exchange. You can only use the Fed central bank digital currency. You can't even use private digital currency. If you've got gold and silver, it is probably be illegal to use it. Now, a black market may exist where people risk using gold and silver, just like they risk trading in drugs and other things. But officially, central bank digital currency will be the only means of payment, the only legal means of payment. And you will be totally dependent on the central bank for the currency. So it looks like they even bypass employers. I mean, it's not even, you don't exactly get paid by your employer. Or if you do, it has to go through the Fed, and they can watch your behavior and decide whether or not you get all of your money or you don't get it. So I don't know. These things remain to be seen. Yeah. If they unfold, we'll see as they unfold how they intend to do this. But now Webb could be wrong about everything except this most likely a pending crisis. And
he's not wrong about the regulations being changed.
He's not wrong about the regulations being changed. He went through them all. He quotes from them, identifies them. And at the end of his short book, he has, as I've reported, a 20-page document of the New York Federal Reserve Bank's response to the European community's questions about what all this means about people and their assets. And the New York Fed is quite clear. They don't own them. They do not own these assets. And they have no right to them if there's a financial crisis. It's there. It's the actual document. You can read it yourself. Well, why would they do this if they don't intend it or don't mean it? It sounds so
Extreme.
far-fetched and awful. It's hard for people to believe. But they couldn't At the time, they couldn't believe that Oswald didn't kill John F. Kennedy. Now, more than half the population believe that CIA and the military were involved, or someone other than Oswald. They couldn't believe that Osama bin Laden didn't blow up the World Trade Center. Well, now 40, 50% of the people think it was an inside job. By the time they catch on, it's too late.
Well, that may be our final point here, Paul. Since if they do enact this, and there seems to be increasing evidence that they will, or at least try to, but if they do pull this off, there's no way out. There's no way to avoid being controlled by them. So the only thing we can hang on to now is exposing this, making the public aware of this, making even some of the big financial people aware of it who would also stand to lose big. So it would be getting this information out, which you are trying to do, before they could set this in motion.
Yes, because Congress could then use its lawmaking power to overturn the regulations.
Right.
But if Congress doesn't know anything about it, or is just too suppressed by the ruling elite, it's hopeless. But if we could make them aware of it, and if they would then use the law, they could kill these regulations. And you see, Larry, I think, as I pointed out before, in fact, it's the title of Webb's book, The Great Taking. It is a taking. It is constitutionally prohibited for them to write these regulations, because it is a taking. It's an uncompensated taking of property, which is prohibited. Well, clearly the regulators knew that, but they went ahead and did it anyhow. So this is what's scary. They assume the Constitution will not prevail.
No.
So apparently the thought is a crisis is so scary and terrible and deadly that nobody will worry about the Constitution.
Yeah. Yeah.
And but you see, I don't know if somebody could bring a case now in advance that would get into the courts, and the courts would have to rule and overturn these regulations. But I think the way the court works, and I'm certainly no expert, is that you can't challenge a taking until it occurs.
Yeah.
Because if I go and say, well, look, they've set up so they can take everything I have. Well, this does it happen? No. Well, what's your complaint? In other words, it's kind of like trying to convict somebody on the basis of an assertion that they might commit a crime in the future.
Right.
Well, this can happen to some kinds of people, but it wouldn't happen to the regulators. So
unless you could legally challenge the regulators usurping the authority of Congress, even though this hasn't occurred yet, what they're up to, but it's provable that they have usurped authority. Congress didn't pass any of this. They interpreted the law the way they want, even though I guess that's already been established in court.
They've been doing that since Roosevelt.
Yeah.
Since the New Deal. We've said before, the New Deal basically created Congress into authorization for regulators to make the law.
So there's already precedent, and that would be hard to
They've been
challenge.
doing it since the 30s.
Yeah, so that'd be hard to
I
challenge.
gave the example on one of our shows, I think, of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which expressly prohibits quotas. The first thing the EEOC did was establish quotas.
Yeah.
Now, to quickly, all of this got me thinking about the Fed. And as I thought about it, and this was a central bank was long a contention in American history. populist people, leaders who responded to the population totally against central banks because of the control it gives them, particularly at the time over farmers. You see, farmers could, the Fed could get farmers in trouble by causing a bust. And so they'd lose all the land to the banks. Yes. So the Fed wasn't established until 1913. That was the same year the income tax. So you can see 1913 was probably the worst year in American history because you got a central bank and you got an income tax. Well, the story of the formation of the central bank, at Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia, I mean, there's a famous book written about it, describes it.
Yeah.
People, the whole thing. It's sometimes said it's the Jewish bankers, though it's not clear to me J.P. Morgan was a Jew. So, or that the Jews at the time had the financial control they have today. So I would say, I don't know if the Rothschilds were involved or not, but J.P. Morgan certainly was not Jewish. So I would just say the bankers, the big banks, Jewish or not, created the Fed. They're the ones that created it. And I think its main function was to bail out their mistakes. So they could be relieved that there was somebody holding the bag every time they got too exuberant and carried away. So, but what is the consequence of the Fed been? What positive thing has ever happened? Well, the first thing they did was totally fail. And we had the Great Depression because the Fed did the opposite of what it was set up to do. It was not a lender of last resort to the banks. It let them fail. 9,000 banks failed. So the Fed was completely derelict. It didn't do its duty. And every business, every person who had a deposit in these 9,000 banks lost. They got nothing. So the businesses failed. Individuals had no money. Rich people had no money. This is the first of the Fed's disasters. Well, every recession, every inflation, every financial crisis since is the direct consequence of the Federal Reserve. It gets rates too low, it gets them too high, jerk, 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 jerk. So the Fed has done nothing but cause hardship and disaster and the concentration of everything, of every industry in the country, particularly banking. Notice the Fed lets all the little banks fail, lets all the regional banks fail, and arranges the financing for the 5 big banks to buy them up. So the concentration of the banking system has just become horrendous. I read, I was a number of years ago, the 5 big banks have 90% of all deposits. Well, this is not a competitive banking system.
Yeah, Paul, the popular misconception, I guess, is that without the Fed regulating, the economy would be even more chaotic. So the Fed is a steadying mechanism. That's the popular and I guess accepted conclusion, that the Fed does good by not making things worse. You're saying it's just the opposite.
It's the opposite. That's just the propaganda. Look, how long were we here until 1913? We didn't have any Fed. Things could have been better arranged. But a lot of people have made the case that the banks themselves were creating support systems among themselves to contain any sort of bank failures.
Well, more of this at another time, but before we wrap this up for today, part four, the final part of your series of the Great Dispossession is still ahead. We'll be posting that shortly. So what's part four going to be about as the wrap up?
I think we've covered it, Larry. Part four is just very short, where I point out that this is a taking, and takings are against the Constitution. And yet we had regulators for 20 years creating regulations entirely for the purpose of taking our property. There's no need for these regulations except to take our property. All the previous financial crisis, the Federal Reserve created the money to bail the system out. Well, it didn't need to take our property. So why has it changed?
Yeah.
They could still let the Federal Reserve bail out the crisis. But the Federal Reserve creates the crisis. And I'm convinced it does that intentionally in order to concentrate the banking system, not just the banking system, but everything. It has concentrated agriculture into agribusiness. You know, all the independent farmers that we used to have, now we've got agribusiness. So what's happened is a handful, the rich and powerful, have used the Federal Reserve to concentrate American industry in a few hands. It's almost like the progressive era never happened. We never had the Sherman Antitrust Act.
Yeah.
We never had trust busters. All this they've erased.
Yeah.
This has been erased. So they have overturned the entire progressive era. And why? So they could dispossess us. There's no other explanation. It's not necessary for them to have the bail-in, as they call it. They can continue to do what they've always done, or except during the Great Depression, they didn't do it. They let the banks fail. But they clearly, there's something is afoot. I mean, it's not a coincidence. And what we really need to do is abolish the Federal Reserve. You know, I mean, David Stockman is on their case constantly. You know, he was the budget director for Reagan. And at the time, he was a great fan of the Fed and was protecting it. And apparently he woke up somewhere along his life. But his attacks on the Fed aren't quite to the point. And the point is, it's the most economically disruptive force in the entire world. It doesn't just screw us up, it screws all of Europe up. It screws up everybody that's part of the Western clearance system. It's a deadly thing. It has no positive benefit. There's nothing that we gain by it. And now we're on the verge of losing not just all our property, but all our freedom. And this is the achievement of the Federal Reserve. People should understand this is a deadly enemy. It's far more deadly than Russia or China or Iran or Biden or the woke crazies or whoever. It's a totally deadly institution. It has no positive virtues. And this was understood by the American public prior to 1913. And they wouldn't tolerate a central bank. And it had to be engineered from above.
Yeah.
And the country's never been the same since. The first thing we got was the Great Depression. And from that, we got regulatory agencies that are unaccountable and that displace the Congress.
Yeah.
So there's no longer any accountability to the law because it's written by regulators who can't be replaced by voting. So you can see and when I think about all of my training in economics, where 4 different universities, all the myths about the Fed that are part of economics, it makes the economists look like 2-bit punk shills for tyranny. That's what they look like. Milton Friedman tried to introduce holding the Fed to a very simple rule, and he devised a rule that he thought would constrain them. But of course, they couldn't even be held to that rules. So anyhow, I think that that's what my conclusion from Webb and thinking about it and trying to sort it out and trying to break it down and explain it. It probably could be done better than I did, but I think I did better at it than Webb. And but my conclusion is it made me think about the Fed. It made me realize that the Fed has really done a job on us and on endless numbers of American family businesses, American family farms. It's a criminal organization. It's committed more atrocities against the American people than all of our wars, all the enemies from all of our wars in history. That's my conclusion. I really can't think of any institution more evil and unneeded than the Federal Reserve.
Well, Paul Craig Roberts, whether to thank you or take cover with your latest prognostication. And you've been right on target all these years. I shudder to think what might be ahead, and maybe probably is ahead. So, Paul, thanks for everything that you're trying to expose and trying to get out to the public so that maybe there's some chance that if more people become aware of it, it can be stopped. But that remains to be seen. Paul Craig Roberts.
Remains to be seen. That's right. Okay, Larry.
Talk to you again.
Thanks for the interview.
Okay.